The story begins with the return of a man who has lived far removed from the people who once mattered to him most. Known in business circles as a ruthless billionaire, Alexander Sterling had built an empire across continents, but in doing so, he lost the tender bond of family life. His only son Ethan had been left behind in a quiet mansion, growing up under the shadow of both privilege and tragedy. Ethan had been born with a rare disability that limited his movement and confined him to a wheelchair. While Alexander immersed himself in boardrooms, meetings, and jet-setting ventures, Ethan lived in near isolation, cared for by rotating nannies and staff who saw their duties as just another job. When Alexander finally returned, of longing but out of necessity. A deal had collapsed abroad, a scandal had forced him to retreat from public life. And so he came back to the home he had nearly forgotten, expecting to find a house managed in stiff order and a boy still distant. He was instead met with whispers about a new maid who had arrived months earlier. Her name was Grace, a black woman in her late 30s, with little on her resume that should have impressed a billionaire. Yet her presence had unsettled and transformed the household in ways he could not have predicted. At first glance, Alexander dismissed her. She was neither polished nor trained in the refined etiquette his staff usually displayed. She spoke plainly, with warmth, instead of rehearsed politeness, and carried herself with a quiet dignity that seemed out of place in the marble halls of wealth. What unsettled him most was the way Ethan looked at her. His boy, who had barely smiled in years, whose eyes had dulled under loneliness, now glowed when Grace entered the room. It was a look of trust and adoration, emotions Alexander himself had never received from his son. Curious and skeptical, Alexander began to observe. What he saw shook him. Grace did not treat Ethan as fragile porcelain, as so many others had. She treated him as a boy who deserved adventure, laughter, and even mischief. She took him outdoors, wheeled him down to the garden, taught him to reach for books, and even encouraged him to try moving his stiff fingers along the keys of an old piano. Ethan responded not only with joy, but with effort, pushing himself to do more than he had ever tried before. Grace's approach was radical, not because of medical expertise, but because of love, a stubborn belief that Ethan was more than his disability. Alexander, accustomed to seeing emotion win over discipline, struggled with what he was witnessing. For years he had poured money into treatments, machines, and therapists, but none had brought out this light in his son. Here was a maid with no credentials, no prestige, yet she was achieving the unthinkable. The moment that crystallized his shock came one late evening. Alexander had returned from a tense phone call, pacing the halls with frustration when he heard laughter echoing from Ethan's room. He pushed the door open quietly and froze. Grace was kneeling beside Ethan, guiding his small hand as he gripped a paintbrush. Colors sprawled across a canvas before them, messy, imperfect, but vibrant with life. Ethan, who had struggled for years to hold anything steady, was painting with her. Not only that, he was smiling through tears of effort. It was then Alexander's walls began to crack. He realized the boy had needed not money, not doctors, but the gift of belief. Grace had given Ethan that gift, still the billionaire's pride, battled against gratitude. Who was this woman to achieve what all his resources could not? What hidden strength did she carry that allowed her to step into a life so unlike her own and transform it? Over time, the answer revealed itself. Grace's backstory surfaced in fragments she never boasted about. She had once been a mother herself, raising a son in difficult circumstances only to lose him in an accident that shattered her world. She knew the pain of helplessness, the grief of watching a child struggle, and the determination to give love while there was still time. When she looked at Ethan, she saw not just a boy in a chair, but a soul waiting to be seen. Her past grief had become her strength, teaching her patience, resilience, and an endless well of compassion. The household, too, transformed under her influence. Other staff members who had grown cold and mechanical in their duties began to soften. The air of the mansion, once lifeless, now carried laughter and conversation. Even the walls seemed less suffocating, warmed by the human connection Grace had reignited. Alexander, though, found himself caught between admiration and shame. For years he had avoided his son, rationalizing that work was for Ethan's future. Yet he now saw the truth. He had abandoned the boy emotionally. The sight of Grace doing the unthinkable, giving Ethan not just care but dignity, forced him to confront his own failures. His return had been meant as a retreat, but it became a reckoning. The turning point came one night, when Ethan, with Grace's encouragement, managed to stand for a fleeting moment, gripping a support rail with trembling arms. It was not a miracle cure, but it was an act of sheer willpower. Alexander walked in just as Ethan stood, his face lit with determination. Overcome, Alexander dropped to his knees beside his son, tears blurring his vision. Grace stood behind them quietly, her hands clasped, not seeking credit but radiating quiet triumph. From that night forward, Alexander began to change. He shortened his business calls, sat with Ethan for meals, and learned to listen instead of command. He asked Grace to teach him how to engage with his son, how to make him laugh, how to challenge him without fear. Slowly, Billionaire and Maid formed an unlikely alliance, bound not by class or contract, but by their shared devotion to the boy. Whispers began to circulate outside the mansion of the reclusive tycoon, who had returned a different man. Though softened by the presence of a maid and his son's resilience, for Alexander, the opinions of the world no longer mattered. What mattered was the simple joy of hearing his son's laughter and the quiet strength of the woman who had taught him what wealth could never buy. The story ends not with perfection but with transformation. Ethan continued to face challenges, yet he faced them with courage. Alexander learned that true legacy was not in empires built, but in lives touched. And Grace, the maid once overlooked, stood as the unlikely cornerstone of it all, proving that love and humanity can achieve the unthinkable, where money and power fail. In the end, when Alexander looked at his son, he no longer saw a burden or a tragedy. He saw a boy alive with possibilities, and when his eyes shifted to Grace, he saw the woman who had reminded him of his own humanity. It was a story of return, of shock, of humility, and above all of love that transcends every barrier.